My talk is S&T policy, how to make your career. So at one point I was in your shoes. I was an undergrad geology major and I was, what am I gonna do next, right? What do I do? So, can you hit the, So let's talk about what I've done in my career so far. Obviously, there are 1,000,001 ways to have a career. And what I just want to point out today is sort of the science and technology policy career. There's obviously writing careers, there's academic careers, there's industry careers, there's like an infinite number, but I'm going to talk about S&T policy. So I got my undergrad degree in Amherst, at Amherst College in geology. I got a master's in geophysics and a PhD in material sciences from the University of Minnesota. I'm actually from Iowa originally, and I wanted to go back to the Midwest for graduate school. While I was doing my degree, and I'm going to come back to this later as to like things to keep in mind. Never say no. It's one of my big things. Always take opportunities when they're shown to you. So I had the opportunity to intern at the state legislature while I was finishing my degree, and my PhD advisor was like, "What do you mean you want to take a day off every week to go to the state legislature?" And I said, "Oh, this is really important to me. If I go every Thursday, can I work every Saturday? How about if I work every Saturday?" He said, "You should be working every Saturday anyway." But I did it. So I worked in the state legislature. I worked for a member of the House of Representatives, essentially, in Minnesota. And it was very interesting to be in the state legislature. State legislature is very different than the federal legislature. You're very close. Right, so you can just pick up the phone and call people and be like, "I work for Representative so-and-so and I have a question." And that happens at the federal level too, but at the state level, you can actually really help people. And it was a very rewarding experience doing that. After that, I went to Washington, D.C. on a AAAS S&T policy fellowship. That is a fellowship where you do actually have to have a PhD. We're going to talk about some of these things where you don't, but that one in particular, you do have to have a PhD before you apply. And there are a whole bunch of AAAS, so that's American Association for the Advancement of Science. AAAS is located in DC, and their S&T policies, they have an S&T policy conference, they do a whole bunch of work. I recommend their website. If you're interested in S&T policy, it's a great place to just get information. But the policy fellowship is a particular one. They put about 200 people in DC every year for 1 year. So there are about 100 folks who end up on the congressional. They end up either in the House of Representatives or the Senate. You can either be in a personal staff or a committee staff. And there's also another 100 that end up in executive branch agencies. They end up at the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy. They end up at the Department of Defense, EPA, all over. Wherever there is science and technology, there are science and technology policy fellows. So it's a great opportunity, and so what I've had printed for you guys, and it's very small, and I apologize for the fact that it's a little hard to read. This is, if you're interested in any of the internship or fellowships that I'm talking about, information on how to find more information about those are in those packets. Okay, so I did that policy fellowship. I was up there for just over a year. I was on the Hill. I worked for a member of Congress from Southern California, and I was there during 9/11. So it gives you an idea of how old I am. But so I was working on the first Patriot Act. So I'd been there just about a year when 9/11 happened. And I remember one of the things that I did while I was there right after 9/11 is that the front office staff person came to me and said, "Hey, can you help me redo our website?" Okay. So we sat down and we redid the website with a lot of information, post 9/11 type information. And we finished and I said, "I'm new in this office, relatively new. Why did you ask me?" And she said, "Because you know how to take a big problem and put it into doable parts." And right, that's what we know how to do as scientists. We know how to take a problem that is really hard and say, okay, what parts can I figure out? How do I do it? I'm going to do this part, and then I'm going to do this part, and then I'm going to do this part. So a lot of times people would say to me, "Oh, are you using your PhD when you are in Washington, D.C.? And that's one of the things I point to, is yes. Because the work that we do as scientists in taking problems and breaking them down and doing them piece by piece is really, it's a skill that you don't even realize you have yet, but it will really serve you well as you get older and get into your career. So, no, I'm only halfway through this page. Sorry, we're gonna be on this page for a while. After I was on the Hill, I went to a nonprofit advocate. So I was a nonprofit advocate with a professional society. So if you think about the American Geophysical Union or the Geological Society of America or any one of these, I actually worked for the American Physical Society, and I was a nonprofit advocate, because when you are a 501c3, which is the particular designation of these nonprofits, you can't lobby, right? You don't lobby, you educate. I was actually a registered lobbyist. So I was in there in the system as a lobbyist, and I did go up to the Hill and I tried to convince members of Congress that they wanted to put more money into science research.
So you were a lobbyist who wasn't allowed to lobby?
I educated.
Right. Okay.
But if you spend more than 20% of your time on Capitol Hill,
right,
or with the, talking to people, you do have to register as a lobbyist.
Right, okay.
Even though we were not technically lobbyists, we did have to register with the lobbying system.
Right.
It's semantics. It's semantics. I was really a lobbyist, just not called that. Yeah.
Did you go into your PhD knowing you wanted to go into like policy and lobbying, or was it sort of something you discovered as you were going along?
I knew I didn't like being in the lab, right? And I'm an extraordinarily extroverted person, and when you are doing 24-hour experiments, overnight experiments, and you're like, I'm so unhappy. And this was a long, long time ago, but I remember my advisor would come by and he'd be like, are you on email again? And this was before 24/7 cell phones, right? And I needed a job where I was going to be more engaged, and I also wanted something that influenced people's lives day to day. And so I didn't know that when I first started graduate school. I figured that out by the time I was done with my master's. But there are a number of these types of jobs that are harder to do. It's not that it is impossible to do them if you don't have a PhD, but it is certainly easier. You just have the street cred if you have the PhD after your name. 6 years of your life, whatever. Okay, but it's a great question. So I was with the American Physical Society for a couple of years. While I was at APS, I took a couple of months off and I went and I worked on a campaign. It was a congressional campaign in Iowa, which was where I was from originally. And if you have the opportunity, if you're interested in policy or politics and you have the opportunity to volunteer on any kind of campaign, strongly recommend doing that. First of all, it convinced me that I never wanted to run for Congress myself. I thought maybe I did. No. But it's a great opportunity to get out there to meet a whole bunch of people who are thinking about policy type questions, as well as get to know sort of the issues that people care about. So that was a fantastic few months. We lost badly. And the National Party had pulled their money. So it was clear that we were gonna lose. And we did. We lost like 58-42. I cried for a week. It's fine. It's all good. These are all character building experiences. After I left the American Physical Society, that was when the Department of Homeland Security had just started up. And so I went over there when it was a startup, worked on a whole bunch of different things, mainly putting together, the legislation had required that there be a national plan for Homeland Security, Science, and Technology. And I ended up convincing the Department of Defense that even though they weren't civilian, they really needed to be there because, when you flatter people, they do what you want them to do. I was a very good lobbyist, right? And so I said to the Department of Defense, like, we can't do this without you. Even though it says civilian agencies, you really can't do it if Department of Defense, which has the bulk of the money in science and technology, if you look at a pie chart of S&T dollars, of what's called 6.1 to 6.3, which is sort of the basic science, more than half of it is Department of Defense. You can't figure out what you're doing for Homeland Security's S&T without them. So they came to the table, we got that done. It was one of the big successes. That's another one of my lessons learned. I did it when I was first in the federal government. I was what's called a GS-13. It's a pretty junior spot in the US government. But no one told me I couldn't talk to DOD and convince them to come to the table. Like, no one told me what I couldn't do. So I just went out and did it. So, just that's one of my other lessons is like, don't be scared to just try things. There are enough people that are putting you down, don't put yourself down. Okay. After that, I went to the Office of Director of National Intelligence when that got stood up. So Homeland Security, what the government did is they said, we had all these big problems at 9/11. We're going to smash these 23 agencies together and make a new department. That didn't go all that well. It's still not going all that well. There's still problems between all these different agencies. So when they wanted to say, okay, let's make sure that all of the intelligence community is coordinated. They said, okay, clearly putting 23 agencies together didn't work well. This time, let's put an agency on top and leave the 16 intelligence agencies to do their own work, and we'll just have somebody on top making sure they're doing it all together and it's all coordinated. That didn't work so well either, right? Because there was no authority, right? These people had responsibility for everything going on here, but no authority. And as my boss told me when I got hired, I actually went on detail to the office to OD&I, my boss said to me, now Sue, these people lie, cheat, and steal for a living. Good luck. So it was interesting, right? Because these are folks in the intelligence community who are used to hiding information. They don't work well across boundaries, right? FBI and CIA, by definition, are not supposed to talk to each other. That was the whole point. That's why there are two agencies. CIA does international and FBI does domestic. They are not supposed to cross this line. Well, that doesn't work anymore in the system we have today. So how do you actually get those folks to talk to each other? And that's a lot of what we were doing at OD&I, is trying to make those connections. One-on-one, you can make connections. It's going to be a long time before these agencies can really function as a whole. I then went to the National Science Foundation. I was effectively a chief operating officer. I handled budget, I handled HR, all those kinds of things. I was there for almost a decade, which was great. And then I went to the Department of, where I am now, the Department of Energy, and I head up our Office for Geothermal Technology Development. So within DOE, it's a big department. It's been around since the 70s. I'm in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, which includes things like solar, wind, water, all the things you think of as renewable, efficiency standards, vehicle technologies, all things like that. Geothermal Technologies used to be the smallest one of those offices. Since I've been there, so when I started 5 years ago, we were $55 million. We're now 110, so we've doubled in size. We have not doubled in staff. In fact, we've halved in staff. That's a whole other story. Okay, that's my career. That's sort of what I did and how I got there. And as you can see, there is no linear progression, other than the fact that you eventually get promoted. Other than that, all over the place. So that's me, hopping from thing to thing. As a little frog. Okay, so let's talk about what science and technology policy is. So on the one hand, science and technology policy is policy that's informed by science, right? It's education policy, it is space policy, it's health policy, it's defense policy, all those kinds of things where what we know about science and technology helps define what that legislation, what that policy should be. There is also policy that affects science and engineering community, right? So that's who can come in and do it, right? So we've got a whole bunch of issues about visas, and those visa policy issues have been around for a decade or more. You've got the question of, so you have appropriations and authorizing. Does anyone know the difference between appropriations and authorizing?
No.
Okay, great. That's fantastic that I can talk about it. So when you are thinking, you're all a little bit younger than me, but do any of you know I'm just a Bill sitting up on Capitol Hill from Schoolhouse Rock? Mm-hmm. It's really retro, right? I grew up, by the way, watching Schoolhouse Rock. That's old. But in any case, so in Schoolhouse Rock, you have a bill and he goes up to the hill, right? And there's the House version and there's the Senate version, and he waits for a conference bill, right? That's the ideal version. But there's two different kinds of bills that go on. One is authorizing bill and one's appropriating bill. So the authorizing bill says there is authorized to be appropriated to do this particular program such and such amount of money, okay? But that doesn't actually give you the money. That just says you can do this, that, and the other thing. The appropriations bills are the ones that actually give you money. So they say, okay, Geothermal Technologies Office, we're giving you $110 million. Of that $110 million, you're going to spend 69 on this, and 17 on this, and 5 on this, etc. That's an appropriations bill. So the reason why this is very important is because the authorized will tell you what you're supposed to do, but you can't do it if you don't have money. And so there is an imbalance in Congress where the appropriators are actually the most important people, because without money you can't do anything. So when you're talking about science and technology policy, authorizing bills are things like, I'm trying to think what the latest versions of them are called, but like the bills that said, oh, we're going to double the size of the National Science Foundation, we're going to give all this money to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, which is part of Department of Commerce. We're going to do all these things, we're going to double the budgets, et cetera, over 7 years. Well, that's fantastic, but unless the appropriators are on board, nothing happens. So appropriations decide how much will be available so in an ideal world, the appropriators will decide how much is available to do science and technology work, and authorizing will tell you what you can and cannot do. So let's take the National Science Foundation for a moment, and let's take Geosciences specifically. So over the last few administrations, there have been some issues, as you may have noticed, with climate change as a topic, right? And there have been several administrations that have tried to reduce the amount of money that the Geosciences Directorate within the National Science Foundation has. They've done the same thing with social behavioral economic, because there was a feeling, oh, that's not real hard science and NSF shouldn't be doing it. So authorizers can say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, but the appropriators can come along and say, we're going to fund it anyway. So you can see where that tension comes in. So as I said, there's policy that is scientifically relevant and informed by science, and then there's policy that affects science. So there's two different kinds of science and technology policy. Next slide. So who does science? How am I doing on time?
It's 20 past.
We're 20
Okay, thank you. There's like, this clock isn't moving, so.
Yeah.
So everyone's in here going, oh, the clock is not moving at all. Okay, so who does science and technology policy? And I put up a number of folks here because everyone always thinks about the fact that the government does S&T policy. That's pretty obvious, right? You've got the federal agencies, you have Congress, you've got the judiciary. Those are the folks who are doing science and technology policy. But in point of fact, you actually have a whole bunch of other groups. You've got the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, and you've got contractors and lobbyists. So let's talk about those for a little bit, because as you're talking about a career in science and technology policy, those are both really important places to look at for science and technology jobs. Because not everyone is going to be in the government, nor does anybody want to be in the government. Let me tell you, there are definitely reasons you don't want to be in the government. So, non-governmental organizations, I already mentioned all the science organizations, American Physical Society, American Chemical Society, American Geophysical Union, things like that. But there's also, when you think about NGOs, Red Cross is one. There's a Union of Concerned Scientists. There's all sorts of non-governmental organizations in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country. They tend to be focused in D.C., but not all of them, that affect science and technology policy, right? These are some of the folks who are going up to Capitol Hill and saying, hey, you gotta fund this particular thing, right? And one of the really obvious places where that happens is with diseases, right? You've got the American Cancer Society and the Leukemia Society, et cetera. And they're up there on the Hill saying, you gotta fund leukemia research, you gotta fund cancer research. Those are very important things to fund. There are also science and technology, there are sort of harder sciences, just non-health related. The National Academies of Sciences is an extraordinary influential organization. It's a non-governmental organization that gets paid by the government to do studies. So if you've heard of the Decadal Survey, this isn't an astronomy audience. So the Decadal Survey is something that the National Academies does every 10 years for science, for physics and astronomy, looking at what are the important research things to do over the next decade, hence the Decadal Survey. And so that's another place where there is science and technology policy getting done and getting done in DC. There's contractors and lobbyists. So we've already talked a little bit about how I wasn't a lobbyist, I was whatever. But there are lobbyists who care very much about science and technology policy, right? So if you think about the fact, like, let's just take, my brother works for Facebook, okay? So Facebook has lobbyists that are up on the Hill and in the Department of Congress constantly talking about science and technology policy. Anyone have any idea what policy Facebook cares about that's science and technology related? Cybersecurity is something, privacy, right? That's really, those are, how do you control who gets into it and what? What about, the Russians influencing elections, right? These are science and technology issues. They're not what we think of when we think about funding at National Science Foundation, but they're really important scientifically related issues. When I was up on the Hill, Napster was a big deal. Do you guys even have ever heard of Napster? So you heard of Napster, right? Peer-to-peer file sharing. So the question was, I worked on a copyright committee. How do you deal with copyrights when everyone's sharing all their stuff? And it was so early, no one had any idea. And I worked in an office that was all lawyers. They had no idea what a buffer copy was. Okay, the truth is I didn't know what a buffer copy was, but I could fake it better than they could. And I could call people and be like, hey, can you explain what a buffer copy is? Because one of the questions on the table was, if a file is going from A to B to C, and it's a buffer and it's being buffered at B, do you have to pay a cost? You have to pay pennies to have it downloaded somehow. And so those are the kinds of questions that are science, they're SMT related, and they're sort of outside of our normal thinking of what that engages. But okay, so that's our lobbyists. Contractors. So I'm sure you all have heard of like Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Okay, the defense industrial complex is one of the biggest and most influential bodies across the entire country, and especially in DC. Okay, contractors get a bad rap, right? Everyone always thinks, ooh, defense contractors, they're the ones building bombs, right? But in point of fact, it's where a lot of S&T gets done. In the defense world, if you include that DOE national laboratories are all technically contractors as well. So Sandia National Laboratories, I'm sure you've heard of, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, I'm not seeing nods. Anyone heard of the laboratories? Berkeley National Lab? All right, great, some of you have. The labs have thousands of people doing work for the government in S&T, right? So what I do, I don't actually do any real work anymore, right? I don't do research. The research gets done at the national laboratories, it gets done at universities, et cetera, but DOE National Laboratories is a really important place to be looking for where S&T policy and S&T work gets done. Okay, next slide. Any questions actually before I move on? Oh, it's so quiet. Okay, so what's so great about working in DC? So as I said here, I hear DC's traffic is awful and the people are self-important. In DC, I'll have to wear makeup and pantyhose if I'm a woman. I'll have to wear suits and ties if I'm a guy. Rent's really high and getting worse. And starting salaries are low. Doesn't sound fun. Why would I want to do this? What's so great about working on S&T policy in DC? Before you turn it, anyone have any idea why you would want to do that?
No. The overturn rate on the hill is really fast.
The overturn, yes.
People are always changing jobs. You could be doing one thing one next week and somebody's just like, hey, we have a spot, you wanna go fill it, and anything. Literally the attrition rate is horrible. People are always getting fired or always quitting.
They're moving, they're quitting because the Hill has the worst salaries. And once you have Hill experience, you're so valuable somewhere else. All right, here's why. Because you can make a difference. So I already talked about some of the things that I've done in my career, putting together a Homeland Security National Plan that actually defined what kinds of research should be done at 20 agencies. Right now I'm working on geothermal technologies. So anyone heard of geothermal? Right, okay, so geothermal is carbon free, it's 24/7, it's flexible, it's everywhere in the country. You can make power with it, you can make heat and cooling with it. It's a fantastic option for the country in terms of energy generation. It's just expensive. It's really expensive. It's risky, you don't know where you're gonna find the resource. It's expensive to drill. The whole thing has just so many S&T challenges. But for every gigawatt that we put on the grid of geothermal, think about what that means, right? We're displacing cars, we're displacing nuclear plants, we're displacing coal. Like, all of this is just fantastic opportunity for the country to grow into renewable energies. And so every day I come to work because I get to make a difference in terms of being able to make geothermal energy more affordable and get it more on the grid. And there's just so many stories in DC of differences that you can make. So, all right. How can I get experience that will make me relevant? So I don't know whether Arizona has any relevant policy courses, but there are several universities that do have either small programs or classes that are relevant. Some universities have residential programs, and I don't know whose those are. I'm pretty sure Rice has one, but I don't know who else. You can get involved with regional, national committees and subcommittees of your particular science society, right? So AGU and GSA, they have chapters, and that's a way to get involved. There are ways to come to DC and talk to your representatives and your senators. You can also do it in what's called their home offices. So every one of them has an office. They probably all have offices in Tucson. I don't know for sure, but I'm sure they do. And going and talking to them individually, talking about why what you're doing is important, is great experience to understand how science and technology gets done. You can volunteer on a campaign. I mentioned that in the local district office or with the state legislature. You want to read a lot. If this is something you want to do, you want to be reading Science, Nature, Chemical Engineering News. Chemical Engineering News actually has an entire section on sort of S&T DC policy. It's fantastic. The Washington Post, The Economist, Wall Street Journal, Politico, The Hill, Roll Call. So this is where what you've got in front of you comes in. So how can I get started? Here are formal programs, and here are less formal ways. One of the things that I think is missing on here, especially for undergraduates, is something called SULI. It's basically doing a fellowship at a DOE national laboratory over the summer. I just don't remember what SULI stands for. And that is an wonderful opportunity to get some real research experience and get to see what national lab is like. I've already mentioned the S&T Policy Fellowship that requires a PhD. The Presidential Management Fellowship requires at least a master's degree. The S&T Policy Fellowship at the National Academies, it requires that you are in or have completed the MS degree. The ORISE Fellowship is at all levels, including when you're coming out of undergraduate, and there are also summer undergraduate opportunities at ORISE as well. The ORISE program puts you either at DOE or at a national laboratory. There's the NSF Science Assistance Program that's, again, all levels, and I found it best for folks coming out of undergraduate. So I've hired many science assistants when I was at NSF, and there's a whole bunch of different things that the science assistants do. So NSF is in Alexandria. It's on the metro from DC. So then there are all less formal ways. So you can get involved, as I mentioned, with the Science and Engineering Societies, or volunteering on a campaign, informational interviews, networking, reaching out to alumna in policy, pounding the pavement, get a job with a contractor. Yeah.
So do those formal programs, do they have some form of like scholarship or like funding to go there? Or?
Well, so the S&T Policy Fellowship, I believe, is sort of at $60,000 a year now. It might be more. There's got to be more. I got paid $48,000 when I did it, and that was a lot of years ago. PMF is also, you're paid at a GS 9 or 11 level. So National Academies, I don't know if that one's paid. Oak Ridge, the ORISE Fellowship is all paid. I know that if you come out with a PhD and do ORISE Fellowship, it's $78,000. I feel like it might be $50,000 coming out with an undergrad degree. I'm not exactly sure, but something like that. The Science Assistance Program, again, you're getting paid at sort of that GS 9, 11 level. So these are pretty much all paid.
So I'm not sure if you're going to talk about it in the future slides, but to find these opportunities, you just kind of like look up like the.
They're all in there. I gave the links.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And we're putting the PowerPoint presentation and the video on the Career Resources website, where you can find the other seminars to RSVP for the March.
Someone might be putting in a plug, right? Also, if you have any questions, you can always just email me. I have cards, and I'm happy to give them out.
How much are these like good old boys clubs?
Well, there's a lot of women.
Well, yeah, just like that mentality behind like if you get like that inner circle in these groups, you need like do
For
this.
these,
Yeah.
not at all,
Okay.
because
Like,
nobody
you
knows
should-
anybody.
Okay.
Nobody knows anybody. So the way that like the AAAS Policy Fellowship happens is, so I've been on the selection committee for those, and folks apply. So let's just say that I was doing for Materials Research Society. And so when you do that, you can either apply directly to AAAS or you can apply to one of the societies. So the MRS ones would come in, let's say I'd get 25 applications. I'd review them and we'd take it down, the rest of the committee and I would take it down and figure out, okay, which six of these do we want to interview? And if I knew anybody of those 25, that was shocking. So it's not that it never happened, but it rarely happened. It would more often happen that I would know someone who had written one of the letters of recommendation. But we don't know the students, so. Any other questions? Okay. So here's my advice. I think this is my last slide. Be interested in a wide variety of issues, never or rarely say no. Let me tell you though, I just got screwed on that one. Because my boss said to me, hey, would you be willing to do this, write up this funding opportunity? And he flat he said, well, Sue, we think this would be really good for you because you spent a decade at NSF, so you really know the STEM field better than anybody else here, and you really work well with the national laboratories. All the national laboratories will tell us how much that they love you, and your office isn't putting that much money into this particular funding opportunity, so everyone knows that you don't have a bias. I should have said. But it's fine, we're moving forward. Rarely say no though, always, to the extent that you can, always say yes, especially when someone offers you something and you're like, I've never even thought about that. If your answer in your head is, I've never even thought about that, give it a try. If your answer in your head is, I've tried that and I really don't like it, then you want to say no, but you just want to open up your world as much as possible. Keep yourself open to learning from others, whether younger, older, across the aisle, less educated, or without an SMT degree. Especially in DC, people are young, they're very young. I remember when my brother, before he worked for Facebook, was a DC guy, and I remember when I was in graduate school and I came and I'm like, this city is run by 25-year-olds. But that doesn't mean they're inexperienced and it doesn't mean they're stupid, right? So be really open to learning from everybody. Write concisely, speak concisely, not that I'm doing a good job of that today, but you always want to, bottom line up front, the bluff, bottom line up front. As my PhD advisor used to say to me when I was writing, he's like, this shouldn't be a novel. Right? So there shouldn't be a surprise at the end. The first line of your abstract should be the most important thing. That's true in memo writing. If you are writing a memo for someone who is high up, if they are only going to read one sentence, you want that first sentence to be the most important thing that they read. Everything else is icing on the cake. Dress appropriately. We get a lot of complaints about interns in DC who are wearing flip-flops and they're wearing, spaghetti strap, whatever, and the guys have their pants down here. You know what I'm talking about? Dress appropriately. Network consistently, not constantly, but consistently. People think that, I'm too introverted and I wouldn't make it in DC because I don't really like talking to people all the time and I just really hate going to parties where I don't know anybody. And you don't have to do that, right? It's not sort of the movie style of networking, right? If you just find some people, and as you mentioned, people turn over. So people generally, a lot of people leave DC, but a lot of people stay and they end up all over DC in all sorts of places. And you want to stay in touch with those people so that when you need them, let me give you one example. So my husband had a fellowship, he's at the Department of Defense, and he had a fellowship on the Hill. And his legislative director was a woman named Miriam. Well, Miriam and I hit it off because she was a lot like me. And she left the Hill and she went to the Center for American Progress, which is one of those NGOs I was talking about that has phenomenal impact on SMT policy. She's a PhD marine oceanographer of some type. But I got a call from the daughter of a friend of mine who needed to interview someone on climate change. I work for the government. I can't talk about climate change. It's just not something I can do. And so I said, hey, Miriam, can you take this call? Can you do this, right? That's why you want to be, that's one example of knowing people all across DC and all over SMT policy. So it's not like I talk to Miriam every day, but I talk to her once every 3 or 6 months. So network consistently. Learn from your mistakes. Don't be afraid to make them in the first place. I read a sign in London once that said, forget the mistake, remember the lesson. It's really important. You gotta learn from your mistakes, but don't let them drag you down. Appreciate the absurd and don't let the bureaucracy get you down. Everyone says to me, what is the most important skill in DC? Is it having a really great Rolodex? No, it is this. If you cannot appreciate the absurd, you will not survive. It is crazy. It is crazy. And there's always something happening and you're like, oh my God, is this really our government? If you cannot find that at least somewhat humorous, this isn't the world for you. I think that may be it. So there you go. Open for questions.
When you say get involved with the local professional societies, what does that look like?
Well, it depends on what's available, right? So I don't really, can you help me out? What are some of the professional societies that have chapters around here? There must be some. There's what?
AWG, Association of Women Geosciences.
There's also probably Society of Women Engineers, there's probably a SWE one.
WISE.
Yeah, I mean, those are all of the women ones, but there are.
Well,
The Arizona Hydrological Society, the American Public Works Association, those are some of them. So,
Yeah, I mean, there's usually regional chapters of things like the Geological Society of America and the American Geophysical Union. There's, for some reason, I just know the engineering ones more. But if you look around and you talk to your professors, they'll know which ones, and then just see what they have available. And what you really want to do is sort of work your way into one of those, get to know a lot of people, and then start doing some of the visits to local, state, and national politicians. That's where you can really have impact. And let me tell you, those folks love hearing from students. They don't want to hear from me. They want to hear from you. And they are so interested, especially the folks that have like the University of Arizona in their district, care so much about what's getting done here, and they don't hear from people very often, right? They hear from the president of the university. They don't necessarily hear from the students who are doing real work. And it really grabs their interest and really can make a huge difference. Because then they've got stories to tell. Let me tell you about, if they're talking to their buddy, they're like, let me tell you about some of the research that my students are doing here at this university in my district. It's so amazing. And they talk. So that's what I would say.
so there's a list and links to organizations on the Geoscience website. If you wanted to look at that, there's a student organization and clubs page, and lots of links to those different parties. There's also the student government here at the university is a great way to kind of meet those administrators and share your research experiences and things and make impact here on campus while you're a student as well. A lot of the students, usually many of the committees that include at least one student representative, and so oftentimes that's one of the students from the student government.
So I'm not sure if you briefly mentioned this when you were discussing your career path, but did you take any time off after your undergraduate degree, or did you go straight into your master's and PhD?
I'm really glad you asked that question. So when I finished and I applied for graduate school, I really wanted to take a year off. Really, really wanted to take a year off. And the advisor I chose, my plan was to, apply to graduate school, get in, and then defer for a year. And my advisor said to me, oh, I understand you want to defer for a year, but Mark and Dave, who are here, are going to be graduating soon, and you really need to learn from them. They're just about to graduate. FYI, Mark retired last year. Okay, he stayed the entire freaking time. And Dave took an extra few years for his PhD. So when I finished my master, so I went, because I was like, okay. So I went, and I was so pissed off that these guys are still there. This is not a rush. I could have taken my year off. That after I finished my master's, I said to my PhD advisor, I said, I'm taking the summer off. I'm going to Israel. And he said, well, you can't do that. The summer is the most important time to do your research. And I was like, David, his name was David Colson. I said, David, I can either quit graduate school or you can let me go to Israel for the summer. I said, okay, you can go to Israel. And what I did was I found a couple of professors in Israel that would sort of let me hang out in their lab. They weren't paying me, but I could still do some research and sort of count it. If you are young enough to be on your parents' insurance and you want to take a year off after undergraduate, you should. I did not. Learn from my mistake. I mean, it's not the most important thing in the world. You will eventually, you're going to have to be a grown-up at some point, but if you can take your year off, there's nothing wrong with doing that.
can I add to that?
Please.
Because I took a year off between bachelor's and graduate school, and I went to DC. And I volunteered in the geophysical laboratory, and that was sort of the way I connected to the National Air and Space Museum and worked on photographs from the Apollo-Soyuz mission and doing geomorphology kind of stuff. And that's actually what ended up helping me decide to go to graduate school in geomorphology. And it was that year off, it was just huge. Yeah, so I recommend it.
Another opportunity talking about going and volunteering when I was in college, my parents had moved from Iowa to New Jersey, right outside of New York City. And so you're gonna recognize a theme in my life, which is sort of pushiness, assertiveness, right? We're not pushy, we're assertive. And I convinced the American Museum of Natural History in New York to let me come hang out with them and do research behind the scenes at the museum. And there are enough museums here that if that's something that interests you, that's a place to go. There's the Geological Society, I know that they have, at least in the past, accepted volunteers. So if you are interested in broadening your horizons, take advantage of what's around you. And especially as an undergrad, you can volunteer 2 hours a week. It's not going to change what you can do as an undergrad in terms of your classwork, but it's going to broaden your mind and really show you some opportunities. So I think that's a great opportunity here. And you're in Tucson. It's like a fantastic place to do this kind of stuff. Any other questions? Yeah.
How is it working with people who didn't have the same sort of science background as you did?
That's a great question. It depends. So when I was on the Hill, I really struggled in my office for the first 6 or 9 months because they didn't know what to do with a scientist. They were all lawyers. And let me tell you, I became, one day because my immediate supervisor had to be somewhere else, I became an expert on the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments of the Constitution. Nothing like becoming a constitutional lawyer in one day. That's the kind of crap you deal with on the Hill. But once you establish the relationship, as long as you treat people, remember I talked about being open to learning, that goes both ways, right? People think of scientists as being eggheads, not relatable. You have to learn not to use jargon. That's really hard for us as scientists, not to use jargon. Really a critical skill. So the ability to write well and speak well when you are dealing with folks who don't know science, and they're always going to say, oh, you're so smart, you have an undergrad degree in geology. The answer is not, oh, you're right, or no, that's not at all true. What you say is, well, what we're here today to talk about is blah, blah. You just pivot the conversation and don't address that. But I have found over time that the older people get, this is especially true, you'd mentioned being in the military. It's especially true of sort of Department of Defense folks. There is so much respect for people who understand things that the older people get, the less threatened they feel by your own science and technology experience. Does that help? Is that sort of the answer you're looking for? Okay, I've taken up a lot of your time. I'm happy to stay around if people want to ask questions additionally, but I'll also let the rest of you go. So thank you so much for coming and for listening to me talk. I really appreciate it.